A very warm welcome to all of you all today. Thank you for joining us today this evening. Before I begin, some basic housekeeping instructions. Please be careful when you climb these stairs. There is one step I know which is a little large, so be careful about it. There are emergency exit doors on your left and right, and in case of any emergency, please do not panic. We have marshals who will guide you to the nearest exit in case of any emergency. Washrooms are located at the ground level, and you'll see them just towards the exit out here. Lastly, to avoid any disturbance, please, and to really enjoy the program, please keep your mobile phones on silent. In case of assistance, you can contact any staff. We are wearing such badges to identify us. I'd now like to start the evening today by inviting Michael Holgate, who is Deputy Director for British Council India. Michael, please welcome and open the session.
Thanks very much, Gauri. So welcome everyone to tonight's session. As Gauri said, my name is Michael Holgate. I'm the new Deputy Director for British Council India. This is just my first month, and this is, I'm happy to say, the first ever event that I'm opening at British Council India, the first of what I hope will be many events here in our theatre in British Council Delhi. And I'm really, really pleased to be that my first event is an event which is very close to my own heart, an event about learning languages and promoting cultural diversity. As a not very good but very enthusiastic learner of languages myself, it's a really exciting event to be my first event in British Council India. The event tonight is part of the India-UK Together season of culture, which is a year-long program the British Council is running to mark India's 75th anniversary and to celebrate the friendship between the UK and India through a vibrant program of events that's going on all this year across music, theatre, cinema, literature, fashion, visual art, and also education. The season is celebrating shared heritage between India and the UK, and tonight's event is really part of that strand of work. It's all about celebrating our shared linguistic diversity and exploring issues around multilingualism and inclusion. Ultimately, the British Council's work, the season of culture, but also the broader work of the British Council is all about connections and trying to foster and improve connections between people. British Council, through the season, is aiming to support more dynamic and revitalized connections between the people of India and the UK. And we hope that through these connections, we will go on to support re-energized trade and investment and technological collaboration, and ultimately go some way to trying to support improving the lives and livelihoods of the citizens of both countries. India's young population and the country's status as an emerging research and innovation powerhouse and as a fast-growing economy provide endless opportunities for our countries to work together on addressing current and future global challenges. And the role of English in supporting this increased collaboration is undeniable. Today's event is a great example of this collaboration. We're supporting the development of closer and stronger relationships, especially amongst English language teacher educators in the two countries. So the topic we're exploring today is learning languages by promoting cultural diversity, policy and practice. And this topic of languages and cultural diversity really gets to the heart of what we do at the British Council. The British Council is the United Kingdom's international organization for educational opportunities and cultural relations. And at the British Council, we know that in order to build cultural relations, it's important to know, what's vital to know and understand a country's culture. And of course, to know and understand a country's culture, we need to be learning each other's languages. And that's why discussions like today's are so important, and why understanding these issues of multilingualism, of language learning, diversity, inclusion, are absolutely fundamental to improving our understanding of different cultures, and therefore to supporting revitalized connections and partnerships, which will go on to support the future growth and development and well-being of people both in the UK and in India. So with that in mind, I hope you find tonight's discussion really interesting and educational. I'm really looking forward to it and looking forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists, to all of you who are joining both in the room and online. Hope you have a good session. And now I'll hand back to Gauri. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. So as Michael mentioned today, really we have gathered here for this panel discussion, which looks at the shared linguistic diversity between India and UK. We have 4 very distinguished panelists with us today, and chairing the session for the evening is Dr. Amol Padwad. I think many of you in the room are aware about who Dr. Amol Padwad is, but I'll just give a brief introduction. So Dr. Amol Padwad is the professor and director for Center for English Language Education, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. He is also looking into INET, Association for English Teachers, in a professional career which is spanning 38 years. He has been a teacher, trainer, consultant, researcher, and community leader. His current interests include history of ELT, teacher communities, networks, rural English language teaching, and really looking at English as a language. Before we, however, go on to the panel discussion, we would like to present insights from research commissioned by the British Council and conducted by Cambridge Partnership for Education. The research is an analysis of cultural representations of India and the UK in English subject curricula. We really wanted to see in this research to what extent is the other country represented in the English curricula and the textbooks of the respective countries. I'm sure you'll find the insights very relevant, and I hope they will spark a collective movement to really celebrate cultural diversity in language teaching. Presenting the findings today is Sarah Nelson from Cambridge Partnerships for Education. Welcome, Sarah. You've joined us online. Sarah's list of achievements is long, so I'm going to have to refer to the notes. Sarah is a curriculum programs manager at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. She is a curriculum expert with over 14 years of experience of working in education, initially in teaching and management with schools, and later in providing technical support for curricula and support materials. She has worked across Central Asia, South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Europe. She is an English specialist with experience of teaching first language English programs in secondary and tertiary education, and she has postgraduate degrees in education leadership and education and international development, with a particular interest in gender and education. Welcome, Sarah, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, hopefully you can now see the slides on the screen. So as just mentioned, I'm going to be giving you an overview of the findings and recommendations that stemmed from this particular analysis. So in our initial engagement with this research, we found the British Council had already identified 5 guiding questions which were used to inform the methodology and analysis of the collected data. And these 5 questions that you can see on the screen, excuse me, these are going to be the structure of our presentation to you today. So before I actually report on the findings in relation to each of these guiding questions, I'm just going to give an overview of the methodology that we used. So we identified in our review 37 different texts that we're going to use for our sample. So these included national and state curriculum documents, and that was across England, India, Scotland, and we also looked at a sample of textbooks. In our sample of curriculum documents, which you can see in figure 1, we've included any that we thought would include English within their remit. So for example, that included education policy documents, syllabuses, frameworks, and any supporting documentation. In terms of the sample textbooks, so those are the ones that you can see in figure 2, we've included texts from Delhi, England, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu. And the choice of these Indian states for review, as I mentioned, was made by the British Council to reflect different contexts. We made the choice to focus on England because we found as part of the review that there were no textbooks that actually met our selection priorities from the other UK home nations. And you can see those selection priorities at the bottom of the screen. When we then came to do the actual analysis of data that we found from those 37 documents, we split that analysis into 2 areas. One was the content analysis, and the second was a thematic analysis. So our content analysis followed Ewan's approach, and that outlined 4 cultural aspects. So products, so this relates to anything that's tangible. So that could be an object, it can also be a fictional character as well. So practices, that included anything that people do regularly as part of their daily life. Perspectives, so we're talking here about any particular viewpoint that people have, so that can link, as you see here, to superstitions, myths, rituals. And then finally, persons, and that was specifically focused on people who are real. And in our application of Ewan, in this particular content analysis, we read all documents in the sample and identified where we were able to identify a valid representation. And by valid representation, what I mean is that the material had to mention or depict culture that was obviously connected to the country of analysis. So for example, an obvious connection to the UK in Indian documents and vice versa. In the thematic analysis, the consideration then became about how the representations actually portray the culture. So we scrutinized the data for patterns, so using keywords and further reading of the data. And similar data were gathered together into themes, often encompassing several keywords and other coding. And these themes were then validated through discussion between the 6 analysts working on this data, and then confirmation through literature. So this thematic analysis was qualitative, and the patterns mentioned are impressionistic, so they're informed by expert opinion. So this formed the core scope of the research, but we did also identify 2 further areas of additional data. So the first was around reading books in primary, and the second was a teacher survey. There are no nationally set books in the UK primary schools, so it's up to individual schools or academies to form their own reading lists. Sorry again. Therefore, we engaged an expert in primary school reading lists in the UK to provide a summary of the sorts of books that are available to young learners in which there are representations of India. If you look in the appendices of the report, you'll actually find that there are 20 identified UK primary reading texts that we found contained representations of India. And these span the whole primary school age range from 4 to 11. In terms of the survey, we utilised the British Council's teacher contact lists and sent a survey to all teachers in the Indian jurisdictions that were the focus of the analysis. In total, we found that 99 teachers actually accessed the survey, but only 35 answered the content questions. So we took those findings and we used them to help triangulate the findings from our cross-jurisdiction analysis, and we talk about that in more detail within the report. So again, more detail about that methodological approach can be found in the report, but I'll move now to talk about the key findings in relation to those 5 guiding questions that I showed at the beginning. So from our sample of 37 documents, we ended up reviewing 4,187 pages of text. And from that, we identified a total of 1,194 representations of culture. And in figure 3, you can see that in partial answer to our first guiding question, there are predominantly representations of products. So this was a huge one. It accounted for 59% of all identified representations. In answer to our second guiding question, we found that all 1,194 representations were within the Indian and English textbooks. So we found that there was no statutory guidance evident in any of the curriculum documents that we reviewed in relation to the use of cross-curricular representation and cross-cultural representation. So instead, we found a significant emphasis on the importance of studying texts from learners' own culture, and then slightly more vague references that suggested learners should also study notable world literature. I won't go into detail again about the UK primary reading books, as I've already mentioned that so far. So moving now to our third guiding question around the kind of representations. As I mentioned previously, there are 4 cultural aspects that I'm going to discuss each one in turn, starting with that most prevalent, so products. And across all 4 jurisdictions that we reviewed, the identified representations of products could be grouped thematically by selection of texts, places, commodities and exports, law and order, and other. I'll summarize the key findings from within each of those thematic groups one at a time. So starting with selection of texts, we found that there were 2 representations of India in texts in the English textbooks. And these were particularly notable because they actually focused their emphasis on the Indian experience outside of India. We found then that there were many more references to British texts in Indian textbooks, the majority of which were historical, which we identified as being published between 1858 and 1947, or they were published pre-1858. One thing that our analysts noted is that all the texts can often be due to be chosen because they're often free copyright. But when we started to dig deeper into the analysis, we found that there was an alternative rationale that could be the choice of that contextualization. And this was particularly notable in the Maharashtra textbooks because we found that texts could be grouped together as either contenders for the first English novel, female-authored Gothic novels, or romantic poets. But across all jurisdictions, we found that the majority of representations of texts are written by men. So in the Tamil Nadu textbooks, the only female-authored text to be directly reproduced in a textbook was actually by a female author who was writing under a male nom de plume. Moving to places. So there are representations of numerous places across the UK in Indian textbooks, but these focused on Scotland and England. We found that Wales, Northern Ireland, and the other smaller islands across the British Isles were never explicitly represented. The representations of place in the UK that we did find, so those from England and Scotland, they did tend to focus on urban and rural areas, with the greatest number of representations being of and within London. There were also a notable number of representations of places of education within the UK, but we found that the emphasis within those was predominantly on Oxbridge and private schools. In terms of contextualized representations of places in India within the England books, we found these tended to focus mainly on Mumbai, Delhi, and Bangalore, and that these were quite predominantly negative, referring to slums and factories. Looking at commodities and exports. So in the England textbooks, we found that the Indian exports were often represented as synonymous with luxury and wealth, and these were predominantly found in those historical and pre-1858 texts. The other main area was around food. So we found that representations of both British and Indian food were really positive, particularly a positive contribution of Indian food to UK cultures was highlighted. In law and order, we have that all the Indian jurisdictions have representations relating to British rule in India. And across the text, the representations were showing individuals and groups from each nation to both be perpetrators and targets of violence and conflict. In all cases, they were either depicted negatively or neutrally. There were also a lot of representations of the British Armed Forces. So that included the British Army, the Royal Air Force. And most of these representations related to their actions in wars, So for example, the 100-Year War, World War I and World War II. A really specific reference that stood out in the England books was India's role in World War II in terms of active service on the Western Front. And finally, in terms of products was other. We found that the most commonly represented product that didn't easily fit into the other thematic groups was actually the British weather. And rather unsurprisingly to our analysts, we found that it's predominantly shown as being very poor. And we'll move now to persons. So after products, persons are the most highly represented cultural aspect. And we found that the bulk of these are represented as adults, and that's despite all of the documents that we found representations in being aimed at children. We also found that many of the depicted persons are authors of literature, although that's rather unsurprising given that the sample textbooks are English language and or English literature textbooks. We found that within that group of authors, they're often male, with Keats, Shakespeare and Wordsworth all noted in at least one textbook from each of the Indian jurisdictions, though there are exceptions. So we found authors such as Jamila Gavin, Christina Rossetti and Enid Blyton mentioned in those books as well. There are representations of people in India in the England textbooks. So initially we found references to people living in poverty, but this is offset by representations of the working world in India with mentions of scientists and literary authors. And that was comparable to what we found in the Indian textbooks with an appreciable number of scientists and mathematicians, such as Stephen Hawking and Isaac Newton. So Stephen Hawking in particular seemed to make an appearance in pretty much every textbook that we looked at. Looking at practices, so we found that the concentration of practices is really low for all jurisdictions, and that was except for Delhi, where we actually found 77 different representations. So practices such as tea drinking, festivals and sport were all evident. There was a particular emphasis on Christian festivals and traditions, so particularly around Christmas was found a lot in those textbooks. We also found that class and socioeconomic status appeared quite regularly throughout the textbooks, that representations of Indian cultures tended to emphasize the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, while representations of the UK included the low socioeconomic classes, as well as references to monarchy and aristocracy, which gave a bit more of a greater variety. Clothing was another represented theme, although there is some variety in the UK clothing that's depicted. There is less variety among the depicted clothing from India. And this echoes the headline finding that there's a lower concentration of representation in England's textbooks than in India's textbooks. And also to flag that we were looking at one jurisdiction from the UK compared to 3 from India. And the final area of cultural representation was perspective, and these were consistently the least represented. A possible explanation for that is that perspectives are often tacit, so they're very tricky to write into textbooks and to discern in a content analysis. But the representations of perspectives that we did identify included references to religion, including Islam and Christianity, British eras such as the Victorian era, and a reference to economic envy between different groups. So moving now on to our fourth guiding question, because we didn't only analyse the data focusing on the cultural aspects, but we also considered the cross-cutting identifiers, such as the eras of history in which the representations originated and the text type that they were identified in. So you can see in figures 4 and 5, the different percentages and the raw numbers of data that we found in terms of each of those. And just to clarify the eras of history, so we have pre-1858, which is self-explanatory. Historical, as I've mentioned previously, covers 1858 to 1947. Recent is from 1948 up to the end of the 20th century, and contemporary are any texts from the 21st century. Fictional refers to any text where it was completely made up and there was no way to identify the actual era in which the text was from. So again, like the methodology, more detail of our findings together with specific examples, they are captured in the report. But I'm now going to move on to address the fifth and final guiding question, and this relates to the recommendations that were based on the findings of our analysis. So we identified a number of recommendations and we grouped these into three distinct areas. So the first relates to curriculum development. The second is around cultural aspects identified in the analysis of the textbooks. And the third around next steps for exploring this area of research further. So focusing first on curriculum development, we found that there's a government consultation underway on the future of Scottish education, and that as the Indian government have recently released the National Education Policy for 2020, we found that this suggests that there are currently opportunities in Scotland and India in particular for the findings of this analysis to be applied. So we're recommending that if the aim of the British Council is to promote improvements in representation, efforts should be focused on Scotland and India using this research to support any advocacy work. In terms of the cultural aspects identified in the analysis, overall we recommended three overarching areas. So one was the promotion of a greater balance of representation across the eras. The second was a promotion of a greater balance in the choice of themes. And the third was providing guidance for teachers on supporting learners to critically analyse the use of representation in texts. We also gave guidance in terms of the individual cultural aspects. So we recommended encouraging textbook authors to improve the diversity of persons represented, to encourage the provision of guidance on incorporating representations of perspectives into teaching and learning materials, to encourage an increase in the number of representations of practices, and to encourage an increase in the number and provide a greater variety of representations of products. Then in terms of next steps for further research, we felt that there were areas of additional research that could build upon this analysis and add further facets to enrich those findings and recommendations. And we found that these could include an expansion to this particular analysis that could include other curriculum grades and/or other jurisdictions, that we could also look at textbooks from other subjects. So for example, historical texts seem to keep popping up within the English books. We also suggest perhaps a survey of British learners to explore how widely the British literary references that we identify in the Indian textbooks are within the UK. We thought that further research could be undertaken to investigate how often and in what way other countries are represented in England's textbooks, and that using findings from this analysis and applying a different lens to explore the impact on readers' engagement with and their interpretation of the identified representations. So for example, this could be an economic lens, a geographical lens, a gendered lens, etc. We also suggested research into the impact the status of English language has on the inclusion of representations by policymakers and textbook developers, and that the interpretation of those representations of readers, so both teachers and learners within those Indian contexts. And finally, we suggested research into the prevalence of these considerations around cultural representations in initial teacher training and in-service teacher professional development. That brings me to the end of my presentation about our key findings and our recommendations. So if you'd like to read our report in full, you can do so by following the link that's on the screen. I'm now going to hand over to Amol Padwad, who will be leading the panel discussion.
You must have found this report quite interesting and stimulating. I find it good, especially in that it raises more questions than it answers, indicating that this is one of the areas which needs more in-depth and urgent attention, cultural diversity in learning languages. So let's carry this conversation forward in the panel discussion that we are going to begin now. And I'm really delighted to be amongst a very august company of eminent educationists from India who are going to be our panelists today. And let me invite them on stage one by one. I would like to invite Maya Menon on the stage. Maya has been in the field of education for 4 decades in areas such as conceptualizing, designing, and implementing a wide range of school and teacher-related projects. Her professional expertise includes school effectiveness research, whole school improvement, teacher development, collaborative approaches to teaching and learning, interpersonal communications in the classroom, leadership, and strategic management of schools. She is an accredited teacher trainer for Jenny Mosley Consultancies UK for training teachers. Maya has written on issues concerning educational practice and management in leading publications like Times of India, Economic Times, and Education World. She was a member of the British Council India's policy think tank for continuing professional development. She was also invited to be on the National Technical Committee of NUEPA for developing standards for school leaders and for several consultation meetings prior to the finalization of National Education Policy 2020. It's my pleasure, Maya, to invite you on stage. I would like to next invite Dr. Dhir Jhingran, who is the founder and director of the Language Learning Foundation, a non-profit focused on improving children's foundational learning at scale in India. He has worked in the primary education sector for over 3 decades, within and outside the government, and is recognized as a thought leader in India and outside on primary education and education system reform. As an officer of the Indian Administrative Service, he served as the Principal Secretary Education with Government of Assam, as Director in the Ministry of Human Resource Development, and Mission Director of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, as well as the District Primary Education Program. In addition, he has handled several other profiles, such as Senior Advisor to UNICEF India, Asia Regional Director and Chief Program Officer with Room to Read, and Advisor to Nepal's Ministry of Education. He is involved in the development of new national curricular framework as a member of the National Steering Committee. He has made significant contributions to developing and implementing early grade reading programs and multilingual education programs in several countries in Asia and Africa and several states in India. Dhir has authored 3 books based on empirical research in primary education and has contributed to many books and journals. May I welcome you on stage, Dhir? It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Ravinarayan Chakrakodi now, who is the professor and academic head at the Regional Institute of English, South India, Bengaluru. He has a vast experience of over 16 years in the field of teacher training and teacher education. He is the chairperson of English language textbooks produced by the Karnataka Textbook Society and the convener of the Syllabus Designing Committee for English for the Diploma in Elementary Education of the Government of Karnataka. He has published a book titled Learn English, Teach English, English Skills for Teachers, and several research-based papers in national and international journals. He is currently leading a project on developing multilingual pedagogy for classrooms at RI Bengaluru. He has worked as the lead coordinator for British Council's Action Research Mentoring Scheme, which is more popular by its short name ARMS, for the 2019-20 cohort. He has an MA in TESOL with distinction from the University of Lancaster in UK. I'm delighted to welcome you on stage, Ravinarayan. And the 4th panelist is virtually with us, and she is joining us online. Abigail Barnett has been with Cambridge International for 12 years. During that time, she has led the development of Cambridge's primary and lower secondary program, including the expansion of subjects on offer as part of the program. She is also a strategic lead on curriculum reform framework with ministry and government partners, and has been involved in a wide range of curriculum review and development programs internationally. She has co-developed an approach to education system evaluation based on the theory of curriculum coherence, and has carried out evaluation work in the US, Bermuda, Kuwait, India, and Ethiopia. Most recently, she has led the development of a new early years program for 3 to 6 year olds. Before joining Cambridge International, Abigail worked as a local authority education consultant, focused on school improvement in secondary schools, particularly working with English departments and on whole school literacy. She started her career teaching secondary English in the UK, and from 2002 to 2007, she taught at a British international school in Bangkok, Thailand. Abigail has a degree in English Studies from the University of Nottingham and a PGC from the University of Manchester. And at the moment, if I'm correct, she is joining us from Tashkent, Uzbekistan. So I think I will join the panelists and continue from there.
So just before we get started, we're going to felicitate the panelists. And I think we have one that we can give to the.
So as we begin this panel discussion now, let me quickly explain the plan of the session. The panelists would be sharing their inputs for about 3-4 minutes each on one of the aspects of the theme. We are looking forward to considering 3 aspects. You can call them 3 C's for short: the concept, curriculum, and classrooms. We are looking at the overarching theme of promoting cultural diversity in learning languages. And if we begin with the concept of culture, we know that it's a very complex notion by itself, and it can't fit into any neat definition. And when it comes to English, it becomes even more complicated. There is a possible argument that English is an international language, so it doesn't have any culture of its own. But on the other hand, we also have our personal experiences of learning English literature, studying English literature, and coming across various cultural aspects of English. So this is one thing, how concept of culture informs this discussion. Secondly, in terms of curriculum, how do English language curricula value and support cultural representations? We just saw very interesting findings from the report that was presented a few minutes ago. And it seems that the picture is quite hazy there. And thirdly, classrooms. So how do cultural representations operate in practice in the classroom? And how can teachers create an environment which celebrates cultural diversity? How teachers can use cultural diversity as an important resource to promote more effective, more meaningful learning of languages. So these are the 3 C's which we would try to focus. And the panelists would be speaking on the aspects which are closer to their hearts. This should be about 3 or 4 minutes each, which will be followed by a very brief round of panelists interacting with each other, responding to each other's points. And finally, the floor will be open for audience interaction. And we look forward to very interesting and fascinating questions from you. So having said that, may I first invite Dr. Dhir Jhingran to present his observations and thoughts. Please, yeah, sure.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Let me begin by, that's okay. Let me begin by stating a few challenges, in promoting cultural diversity and how they relate to language learning. One of the big challenges is about an assumption, which is actually a myth, about the sameness of young children. I work basically in primary education, our organization as well. The belief of educators is this, that all young children are the same. They've come to school, they're going to be empty vessels and we've got to fill them. They're quite, all of them are the same. While actually children, even at age 6, have fairly developed identities based on the variety of socio-cultural factors, their socio-economic situation, gender, ethnicity, religion, all of them shape an identity that child has. And if we want children to learn well, it is important that for the educator, the teacher and others to understand the children's contexts and cultural backgrounds, their worldviews, where they come from, what is their immediate environment. Even organization like ours, we work on teaching and learning. We sometimes make a mistake of trying to focus just on a teaching method. How do you teach children to learn to read? As if it is completely universal. It is not rooted in the cultural practices, the cultural worldviews of children. So that is a big challenge there. And I come therefore to mindsets and attitudes that influence this whole arena of cultural diversity and language education. And the most common view across the education system, and we work with the government education system. Oh, it's not showing here. Okay, you're seeing empty boxes? Oh, we will. Okay, so the first view is what's called a deficit view, that there is something that needs to be corrected. There's something that is not up to the mark in a culture or a language, and therefore reflected in, for example, the language is inadequate. There's impoliteness, or children don't seem to be as civilized. They're less intelligent. I'm trying to teach them, but they don't seem to learn. This is very common across the country. When teachers and the system is faced with children who may be different from a kind of mainstream culture. Now, an opposing view that I think can inform this whole understanding of cultural diversity and of course related to language learning is that all languages serve a complete purpose for the communities they're spoken, that speak those languages. None of the languages are deficient in any way for those communities. They're using it for all purposes. Right. Those children who come to the classroom looking different, their ways of being are different. They've come from a background which is different. It's not deficit related to some other standard that we have. They've come with a different experience, knowledge, language, maybe coming from a non-literate environment where there's no print available. But that doesn't mean that that's deficient. It is something that the school needs to adjust to. So I think cultural diversity, the most important is our mindset about how do we look at children who are different in that sense. And therefore, I think the most important point here is to understand that can we value diversity in the classrooms in terms of language, in terms of culture, and children can be different, they will be different. One of the challenges has been that teacher preparation, as Maya will speak more about probably, does not prepare teachers for the cultural diversity that they actually encounter in the classrooms. And now with the centralized teacher eligibility tests, a lot of teachers are coming from urban, semi-urban backgrounds and have never faced diverse classrooms from cultures that look very different. And that's a big challenge. So just understanding that, valuing that, almost promoting and celebrating that, and also multilingualism, which was mentioned. That's very important. Language, culture, identity are very closely linked. So it's important that we provide space to several languages, including non-dominant languages. So that's we'll go over it. We won't go over it again. So that was the last point here, okay, yeah. Now, this was about mindsets and attitudes. And just looking at some representation of, in primary classrooms, often the textbooks, especially this is from language and EVS textbooks, seems to represent a reality that is not very common. That's a grade 3 EVS textbook on the right-hand side. And it's about food that we eat. And it's not something which is really very common, at least in the public education system, the schools that these children are going to. On the other hand, more culturally appropriate representations are also available. And a lot of this work has happened in local languages, especially non-dominant languages, where there's flexibility of making materials, which is not governed by the state system or the NCERT. And a lot of these materials have been made, which seem much more culturally appropriate. And we know that it is very important for language learning for children to have stimuli that are close to their environment. They understand very well, can motivate them. And I'll end by saying that the new national curriculum framework with which I'm associated seems to recognize this. Of course, as we know, between policy and practice, there's a huge gap. And what happens is nothing is sure, but recognizes that children's cultural identities are very important. They need to be recognized. They need to find expression in the classroom. And using home languages is one of the ways of it. And that's where one of the intersections that talks about between the cultural diversity, cultural expression, and learning of languages. It squarely recognizes the importance of multilingualism and multilingual education. And that's very central to the new education policy, as well as the NCF. Also, because we know that curriculums go statewide or countrywide, textbooks are for a whole state, the NCF suggests that there are other ways that must come into the classroom, especially for young children. That's play, music, art, craft, and it lays a lot of emphasis on that, saying it's a holistic development of a child. And this is a space where a lot of the local culture and cultural diversity can come in, which may not be represented fully in the textbook. And to end here, the section on textbooks and content actually emphasizes that content must be drawn from children's experiences, their cultural, social contexts, must be diverse and inclusive, avoid promotion of cultural stereotypes, and have very diverse cultural and diverse linguistic books and storybooks in the classroom. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much, Dr. Dhir. This was a very interesting socio-cultural lens on the textbooks and the classroom practice. I would like to invite Maya to throw some light on this, in the light of this theme, to share your observations.
Yeah. Thanks, Amol, and thank you, Dhir, for sort of setting the stage by talking about children first. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to just sort of step back a little bit. I think Dhir sort of talked a lot about the need for a multilingual approach to be culturally diverse, to be culturally sensitive. In India, we are bookended by two important reasons why English is important to us as a language. And through that, I'd like to highlight the dilemma of learning language in a culturally contrary environment. So on the one hand, we have English, rightly or wrongly, has been accessible for decades, pre-independence also, only to the upper classes. It has been seen as a language of social, economic, and cultural privilege. And it's been kept as a very exclusive language. In fact, to quote Professor Krishna Kumar, he said way back in 1996 in his book called Learning from Conflict, he says that English has a unique position in India. Competence in the use of English is the single most important marker of a young person's eligibility for negotiating the opportunity structure that the modern economy has made available. The ability to use English fluently has become a synecdoche, which means a socially understood shorthand for general ability. So that's where we are at one end. And on the other hand, we have Dalits who've mobilized the symbol of privilege, which is English, which English enjoys in India. And they've created this goddess English, which some of you must be familiar with, or many of you are familiar with, which is an attempt to help them climb the socio-economic ladder. And this goddess English has in her right hand a pen, and on her left hand a book, and she's dressed well and sports a hat, a symbol of defiance, rejecting the old traditional clothes. And this was created by this Dalit writer, Chandrabhan Prasad, and who also attributes Dr. B.R. Ambedkar of having said that English is the milk of a lioness, and those who drink it will roar. So in that context, we have to look at where do teachers fit in, because as Dhir said, I will talk about teachers and working with teachers, because the nuances of a language, in English in this case, are rooted in the culture it develops and evolves in. And in this case, English, as it has evolved and got rooted in our country, in India. It is also a fact that English has influenced India's cultural and aesthetic sensibility. So I'm talking about all this because all this is linked to cultural diversity. In fact, the late David Gradall, in his book, English Next, wrote about India reinventing as a modern society with a unique cultural, linguistic, and intellectual offer. But our own rich languages are key to develop our intellectual and cultural personhood and identity, as Dhir very rightly said. So in this context, how do we teach English in a culturally diverse country like India? Also, how should we teach Indian languages in a culturally diverse contemporary India? That's the big dilemma that we have. And that's where teachers come in. And our teachers have the difficult task of skillfully navigating this complex social ecosystem with conflicting and contradictory priorities. And a lot of times the teacher herself or himself is not necessarily somebody with a great deal of agency. Teachers themselves are biased by their own limited lived experiences and constraints. Teachers have inadequate and frankly often poor teacher training, especially initial teacher training. Of course, Ravi will come in and talk about what he does, which is different. And they themselves have biases and stereotype beliefs. Sarah had talked about the 4 Ps in the Cambridge report: products, practices, perspectives, and persons. And when I read the report and I thought about my own work with teachers, that we work with thousands and thousands of teachers, I think teachers are very, very limited with stereotype beliefs and biases about people, about places, about practices, as well as about products. And in this context, and all of this, they have suboptimal fluency in the language, since we're talking about promoting English language in a culturally diverse environment. So keeping that in mind, it makes for a very, very complex, difficult system where teachers have to try and function as effectively as possible. But what is possible? A lot of things are possible. But I think the important thing is to, first of all, recognize that these are big challenges. And unless we address these challenges head on, we will just be talking about great intentions, the National Education Policy, the new NCF, which is in the making. All of those are great intentions, but there's a big gap between what we intend and what we actually implement. And that's the tragedy of our education system, the fact that we are good in our policy making, but we're poor implementers. And I think that's where we need to be examining how can we support teachers. But I'm going to stop here because I'm going to hand over to Amol, and I'm sure we'll continue the discussion.
Thank you, Maya, and I'm going to come back to you on that last point you made. But before that, let me request Ravi to share his thoughts. Yeah.
Good evening. Also, I've got a few slides, but before I show the slides, let me read out an extract from a lesson that has been prescribed in one of the textbooks. I was really, really surprised to see this lesson in a government textbook. So let me just read it out. The title of this lesson is "The Danger of a Single Story." I'm a storyteller, and I'd like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of a single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think it probably happened when I was 4. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather. How lovely it was that the sun had come out, but I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. It goes on. She's actually a Nigerian writer, and her name is Chimamanda, I'm not good at pronouncing, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Is a Nigerian novelist. She is regarded as the most prominent among young Anglophone authors in African literature. She goes on, and then she says, actually, she says, now things, I'm reading for the later part of the lesson. Now things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But when I read Chinua Achebe and Kamara Lei, I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, she goes on. And then finally, but I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education, so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salary. She talks about her life. The point is, since I have had a cursory look at many of these textbooks prescribed in South Indian states. Some textbooks present only the source culture, the local culture, the regional culture. And some textbooks present the target culture, like the culture where English is spoken as a first language. If you look at some international course books, you will see that. And some textbooks like this present other cultures as well. World cultures or global cultures or cultures of those countries where English is not spoken as a first language. So my argument is that what do we mean by cultural diversity? What cultures do textbooks represent? Do they represent only the source culture? Do they represent the target culture? Or do you think they also need to represent world cultures where English is used as an international language? So presenting culture as a content is one thing. We can pass on cultural knowledge, but how do we deal with it? Okay, so yes. Oh, just 1 minute. So how do we deal with the cultural content? I think that's a very important question. I spoke to the teacher who handled this particular lesson. She began by asking children, so what comes to your mind when you think of Africans? They gave out words like poverty, sickness, Negro, and all those negative images about Africans. And they read this lesson. So what happens is they continue with this, with such prejudices, stereotypes, with their own assumptions. Cultural content, the materials that we present should help children reflect on those materials. I think textbooks should be used as a reflective tool. Our teachers, as Maya was rightly saying, our teachers are ready for this. Traditionally, second language textbooks have been used for developing communicative competence. If you look at the broad aims of teaching English, they have to develop LSRW skills, listening, speaking, reading, writing skills. I think it's equally important to develop students' cultural competence. It's not that everybody goes abroad, travels a lot, but they'll have to interact with the cultural content given in the textbook. They'll have to interact with the cultures of other countries. And teachers have to develop the cultural competence. So it's not just developing communicative competence. I think what is important is developing cultural competence. I would call it intercultural competence. And not just developing competence, developing critical consciousness about different cultures. So when only source culture, local culture is presented, they develop an identity based on that culture, my own identity based on the culture that I've been exposed to.
Yeah, thank you, Ravi. You are indeed making a very interesting point, but would you mind if we come to that via question answers?
Yeah.
I have noted some of the points and
Right.
we'll come back to that. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And finally, let's come to Abigail. Abigail, you had a very insider kind of experience of looking through textbooks and how cultures were represented. So what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, great. We didn't get the chance to do a check, so I just wanted to check. Yes, so as you might imagine, I'm going to talk from the perspective of curriculum, and specifically around the point that in our research, there wasn't any statutory guidance for what to include with respect to culture when you're designing your curriculum and textbooks that are based on the curriculum. So just a few comments from me about why that might be an important thing to do and how policy can be influenced in that area. So textbook isn't a curriculum, but in many countries and in many places, the textbook is the visible realization of the curriculum. So it has a very important status. And what's found in a textbook is therefore taken very seriously. And teachers and students will want to be able to trust what's in the textbook in terms of the content being accurate. They'll want to think it's a high quality textbook, and they'll want to think that it's helping them to learn what the curriculum intends. So textbooks have this high value, this high status, and I think with that, therefore, comes considerable responsibility. And when you're developing a textbook, there are many judgments that you need to make, many decisions that you need to take. And that includes the content that you're going to select, of course. And we've seen that some of that then constitutes these cultural representations, which carry with them all kinds of values and can be interpreted and received in many ways. And then there's those who often there's processes to quality assure or approve textbooks before they can be published. And I think that's been alluded to already. So we should really consider, well, who is responsible for these two activities, the development of textbook materials and the quality assurance. I think in the report that perhaps is going to give us an opportunity to start a conversation about cultural representation with these organisations or departments who have what we've seen is quite a great responsibility. Again, just picking up on something else interesting in the research, we didn't have in scope looking at how learners receive and respond to cultural representations. And I think this would be a really interesting area to follow up so that we could increase our understanding of how learners are perceiving the representations in textbooks compared to other sources of cultural representations that they're exposed to. So I was thinking about TV and social media, in music, in sport. Are they more likely to be influenced by what's in textbooks because it's formalized, it's been approved, it's part of their school experience? Or are they more likely to be influenced by the media because it's such a dominant force? And if it is the latter, so if it's the media that's more dominant in terms of its influence on cultural representations, then I think it's even more important to ensure that textbooks can contribute very positively to counteract bias or stereotypes, and can help learners to recognise when they're encountering bias or stereotypes. One reason it might be important to influence policy in relation to cultural representation in textbooks was that, as you heard in the findings, we identified that there were opportunities to increase the diversity of representation. For example, including more contemporary representations, which may be less likely to be stereotypical, promoting a greater balance in the choice of themes in textbooks, a better use of inclusive language, and increasing the diversity of persons who are represented. All of those things would increase the diversity that we found in our research. In addition, we talk about in the research, in the report, that as learners develop their skills of critical analysis, perhaps there's an opportunity to introduce them to more sophisticated ways of engaging with a range of representations. There's an opportunity here to help them develop those critical thinking skills so they can really question as they get older about the way something's been represented and how that gives rise to either a positive or a negative interpretation, and what factors there are that are influencing that, whether they're social or political, economic, etc. So finally, I'd like to hope that the research usefully contributes to definitely what are wider discussions about language and culture, as we've heard in the comments from the panelists already. But providing guidance to support and encourage diverse cultural representations in influential materials like textbooks will ultimately lead to richer and more informed educational experiences for our learners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail. I'm sorry, I'm just aware of time, and with the panelists' permission, I think we will slightly modify the structure. And I'm just going to ask you all one common question, and then we'll immediately throw the floor open for audience interaction. All panelists have, you will agree, underlined the importance of having adequate cultural diversity in language learning, whether it be in textbooks or teacher preparation or classroom practice. And the report actually shows that the cultural representations, cross-cultural representations, especially in terms of diversity, are neither adequate in quantum nor adequate in diversity. So if this is the scenario, you can pick any one of the areas that you feel comfortable with, whether curriculum or teacher training or textbooks. And can you make one suggestion where you think there could be a way forward?
Thanks, Amol. So I would like to talk about curriculum, but also about supporting teachers, because that's the work I am deeply involved with. Because you can't have a great curriculum with poor quality of teacher support and teacher training. Whereas if you have great teacher training but poor curriculum, you can still do a great job. So while we do need to have better, more diverse cultural representation, I think teachers need to know how to negotiate that, because otherwise you may have wonderful textbooks, you may have a great curriculum, but the point is that the teacher will understand it at a very surface level and therefore deliver the curriculum in a very, very mechanical manner. So for that, teachers have to be exposed to ideas of how you can actually look at more cultural diversity. I was thinking some examples I was thinking of since this Cambridge report started in India. One of the states was Tamil Nadu. Suppose we use the whole Chennai music season. That's an example of cultural diversity. But you can talk about so many things. You can talk about the music, you can talk about Carnatic music, you can talk about the artists, you can talk about different points of view, like writings by T.M. Krishna, who's against the Brahminical, sort of fiefdom of the Chennai music season. And through that, it just opens up children's minds to thinking, to culture in the country, as well as examining the language. you're using language in a very real, authentic way. And you can also sort of parallelly look at, if you're looking at UK culture, because we're looking at representation of other cultures, you can look at maybe the Edinburgh Fringe Festival or Glastonbury and look at comparisons, because these are very popular cultures, festivals, and how do they marry? How do they map with each other? I think that makes it so exciting for teachers as well as for children. And now today with technology, so much is possible, even though a teacher may not have gone to Edinburgh to experience the Fringe Festival, or the teacher may not even have gone to Chennai to experience the Chennai music season. You can still see that through the YouTube videos, through walkabouts that you can do through virtual reality and so on. So this is just one example.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dhir, would you like to add something?
Just very briefly, just one point about learning an unfamiliar language, let's say English. While we focus on English as a language in the textbooks, very often this fact that this is a second language and therefore needs different ways of teaching. And a language acquisition happens initially through a lot of exposure to rich oral language, which is, in conversation, storytelling, read alouds, in a meaningful and purposeful manner. Now, of course, there is a problem that many teachers do not have that kind of proficiency in English, but to understand that acquiring a language is very different from where the focus on the first language or the language children know is on literacy right away. But in English, it really has to focus. So that understanding is very crucial. And I'd like to say, if one thing, I think a multilingual approach to, which also falls in line with our theme of cultural diversity, that languages should not be isolated from each other. We should not say this is English only time. This time you cannot speak in other languages. How do they scaffold the learning of an unfamiliar language is very crucial.
Just one point. I think cultural diversity should come in a big way in pre-service and in-service teacher education curriculum, which is not there right now. So this is, I think this discussion is also very important when states are developing state position papers on different subjects and languages. So I think it's important.
Thank you very much. And let us now move on to the audience questions. And my request would be to be very brief with your questions. Meanwhile, questions are also invited from people watching us online. And let me just quickly mention a couple of interesting comments which have come up on the YouTube live. Linking with what Dhir just said about proficiency, Chandra Prakash Chandan mentions his concern about first improving the English language proficiency of teachers, especially in Bihar, because that would inform better handling of cultures in the classroom. And Darshana Bapat says culture is really the least important factor in language learning. And that too in a multicultural country like India, where it is expected to be the most important factor. And I think we all agree with that position. So let's have some very interesting questions. And let me also remind you that it may not be possible to take all your questions, but after this panel discussion is over, we will have chances to continue the conversation over the networking and refreshments happening after the event. So you still have the chance to ask any of us.
Thank you, all the panelists. It was a wonderful discussion. So my question is that as for NEP, one of the highlights is to teach multilingualism at the primary level in the Indian schools. But it is a great challenge for the teachers. So what do you suggest, Maya ma'am, especially to curb this problem and find out some plausible solutions for the teachers to teach multilingualism?
I think one has to understand when we're talking about multilingual, it's not a problem. I think it's a solution. I would say it's a solution because teachers are trying to make the language a new language or a second language or a foreign language accessible to children whose home language is different. So therefore, the teacher uses the home language as a wire to help them access the new language. So in that sense, not a problem. It's a way in which the teacher is making a new language, a foreign language, accessible. So teachers have to learn to be skillful. I agree. So that's why we can't, teacher support is always given short shrift in all this. These are great intentions, but we have to make it possible. And it is possible to do it, but we have to create teacher support. And in fact, the cluster hubs, I mean, the NEP talks about, having cluster-based hubs of excellence. So if those could be hubs for teachers to learn from each other, share ideas, share resources, support each other, that would be a good way to ensure that classrooms stay multilingual.
Anyway, my mic here, please.
Thank you, panelists. So although Maya ma'am already hinted, so my question is a little extension to that. What role can technology play to support language learning in a culturally diverse classroom? So specifically if we come to the classroom.
So, Dhir, would you like to respond to that?
Just one point, and again, because the focus is on English, and we were discussing just before the discussion that teachers are often not proficient in English, right? And they're learning English. Even the most important, as I said, was communicative, conversational English, which the teachers are least comfortable with. They can say A for apple, B, they can read words. Now, if we have to begin there, teachers need to learn enough English of this type to be able to use that with children. And technology has been used, low-end technology in the form of interactive radio instruction, in the form of sound boxes with recorded English sentences of different grade levels, including stories or simple commands to stories, which in a way, while teachers listen to them, they also first do it with children through that resource, and then of course start to take it on. So that's one low-end technology use that I have seen for supporting language learning, especially in unfamiliar language.
Yeah, very interesting. May I invite Abigail to share her thoughts on if you have any experience of how technology has been used or helped cultural diversity and language learning?
Yeah, I mean, as we've just noted, I suppose that one of the advantages for any teachers that are teaching English anywhere in the world is that there's a huge number of resources that are available, because English language teaching is very prevalent in many countries. So there is access, and kind of easy access to lots of resources. Some of them better quality than others. Of course, you've always got to look for that. But I think that in terms of availability, that's very good. And obviously, since we've had, as long as the accessibility is there to get online, then there are many. And of course, another advantage is that they're freely available. So rather than having to purchase expensive resources, I think that technology has opened up in some respects that availability to good quality resources.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a very interesting, yeah, please.
I just want to add very briefly to what both Abigail as well as Dhir said. I think technology is a great way to help teachers, support teachers. And in fact, currently we're working in Karnataka with 2,000 teachers on just help equipping them with spoken English skills. And they're from across Karnataka, and it's an online course. And teachers are accessing it through their smartphones. All government school teachers at least have smartphones. And we're using not very high-end technology, it's just Google Classroom and Zoom. But through that, they have access to YouTube videos, other links, and so on. So much is possible today, especially post-pandemic, even in rural parts of India.
Thank you. A very pointed question on YouTube. Darshana Bapat from Ratnagiri asks, will new education policy 2020 improve the condition of inclusion of culture in language classrooms of India? Who wants to respond to that?
Basically said that, there's a huge gap between policy and practice. So while I think all the right things are being said in the policy as well as the curriculum framework, it is all about mindsets and attitudes. When we know that there is multilingualism in the society, we still have a dominant language culture in the classroom. So it is about changing mindsets. A policy document can only say the direction in which we're going. So we really don't know. It's important to give it a try.
Yeah, so the policy provision has been made. Let's see how it rolls out into practice. And there is a very interesting comment from Gary Mocharam. The problem with printed textbooks is that they may be used for a long period of time and are therefore not up to date, and so represent cultures that no longer exist. The move away from printed textbook to digital forms of textbook may help solve this problem. And I think this was one of the issues that came up. It's not just representation of culture, but also representation of contemporary culture, because culture is such a dynamic thing. Can we have one last question, please, if we have any? Yeah, please.
Although I am from an entirely different background, I am from an engineering background, but I had been to teaching since last 15 years to the engineering students. What I found, like, see, majority of the students, they fail in competing with the recruitment process because of the English communication. And I very well do agree with, if curriculum is not good, but is the skill and the classroom environment is fit, then the wonderful change can occur. What exactly I really don't comment upon the political will of the Indian politics and all, but the thing is, like, see how British Council can contribute to the rural area where 2/3 of the population still resides.
I don't think any of us on the stage are qualified to answer that question, but I very strongly recommend the Deputy Director of the British Council is amongst us. And you can catch hold of him after the panel and over a cup of tea. I think he would be happy to respond to you. I agree, it's an important question, but none of us are qualified. So I think on that point, let us close this panel discussion, though I think you share my feeling that we could have more time at hand. The discussion was just warming up. But as I said, this is the beginning of getting into an area which requires much deeper, much richer, and much wider attention, and which is often implicitly taken up while designing curriculum and producing textbooks, or even while teaching language in the classroom. So culture in language learning is such a massively complex, but at the same time, fundamentally important component in language learning. I hope the report that was presented earlier and the discussion we had has left you with lots of questions to ponder on, and maybe try to relate to your personal experiences and practice if you are teachers, teacher educators, or even policy makers. Thank you very much on that note, and I hand over to Radhika now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's only customary to have a final vote of thanks. I think I want to begin by thanking Amol first, because you were the perfect Sutradhar today. You brought the best ideas together and got the best out of the discussion. Thank you very much. Can't forget the panelists, of course. Maya, Dhir, Ravi, Abigail from Uzbekistan, if I remember correctly. Also, a special mention for Sarah, who made a wonderful presentation at the beginning. I think all of us came from different but related fields of experience here today, and I think it was a great meeting of minds and ideas. Hopefully, we bridge the gap between policy and practice. Hopefully, we have some practical ideas from today's panel discussion. I cannot thank, I must thank the audience, most importantly, also the online audience who have joined us today for the brilliant questions that have come from the online world and also from you. I think those questions have been very important and critical, again, to bring the best out of the wide range of experience we have here today. I will also extend a quick thanks to Access for All, who are our equality, diversity, and inclusion partners. You've seen Manisha and Sarah here signing through the event. I must thank all the British Council colleagues who've been instrumental in making this event happen. Special thanks to Michael for making time today. Just a quick 2 things before you leave for refreshments at Charbagh. We will be sharing an audience survey with you later on email, so request you to please fill it in. It will be helpful for us to know your views and how you felt today. And of course, moving on to the refreshments. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.